Hello and welcome to today's panel discussion, Breaking Barriers, a Response to the Story of Sheryl. My name is Sarah Kiskadden-Bechtel, and I'm the Program Director for the Completed Life Initiative, and I'll be your host today. At the Completed Life Initiative, we promote self-determination and dignity at the end of life. If you are new to our event programming, please feel free to explore our video archives on our website after today's event at www.completedlife.org. Bear with me one moment while I share my screen. There you go. Today's panel discussion explores the complexities of our inaugural podcast narrative, The Story of Sheryl. Today's esteemed panelists will discuss the elements of Sheryl's story that intrigue our listeners, you, in both episode 1 and episode 2 of the Voices of the Completed Life podcast. What does Sheryl mean when she says she is one fall away from having a bad death? In what ways does Sheryl want to have a gentle death? What are the challenges that she faces in achieving a peaceful, completed life? Whether you are new to our Completed Life community or are a returning attendee, we invite you to ask and think about lots of questions. These sessions are invaluable learning tools meant to empower you to have an informed conversation for yourself and with your loved ones about the question, what does it mean to live a completed life? A little background on our speakers. Dr. Mark Ligorski, MD, attended Columbia College and then received his medical degree from the Autonomous University of Guadalajara School of Medicine. During his years in Mexico, he helped run the La Señora de la Merced Clinic, where he began to appreciate the challenges of providing healthcare to disadvantaged people who had different cultural attitudes to health, sickness, and death. He completed his psychiatric training at Westchester Medical Center and psychoanalytic training at New York Medical College. In general private practice for many years, his work has encompassed adolescent psychiatry, eating disorders, human sexuality, Buddhist spirituality, death and dying, and most recently, psychedelic medicine. Dr. Paul Menzel, PhD, has published widely on moral questions in health economics, health policy, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, also known by the acronym VSED, and advanced directives for dementia. Professor Paul Menzel taught philosophy at Pacific Lutheran University from 1971 until 2012, where he became professor emeritus, having been educated at Worcester, Yale, and Vanderbilt. Teaching widely in philosophy and cross-disciplinary curricula, he has also published specialized scholarly work in healthcare ethics, including 2 books on moral questions in healthcare economics, numerous articles on health system structure and healthcare reform, and in 2012, a co-edited volume on the tension between treatment and prevention in health policy. He has also served Pacific Lutheran University in various administrative positions, including provost, and became professor emeritus in 2012. Paul is a member of our Paul is a member of our esteemed advisory board at the Completed Life Initiative, and he recently co-authored a book published by Oxford University Press in 2021 entitled Voluntarily Stopping Eating and Drinking, a compassionate, widely available option for hastening death. And last but not least, Dr. Lew Cohen, MD, is a Guggenheim Fellow in Health and Medicine and a Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at both Tufts and the University of Massachusetts. Lastly, he's working on his 3rd nonfiction book for the general public entitled Winter's End, about a man with Alzheimer's disease who took his life. Welcome, Lew, Mark, Paul. It's an honor to be with you here today. For those of you in the audience, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, please be aware that you may input your questions into the chat feature located on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We welcome your questions at any time throughout today's event, and later on we will turn to your questions for an interactive Q&A with our panelists. Also, if you'd like assistance with closed captioning, you may toggle on the box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen that provides captioning for the spoken words of our event today. Throughout today's event, feel free to tag us in your social media posts and tweets at Completed Life and hashtag Completed Life. Finally, the recording of today's event will be published after today's event concludes. All right, thank you all. And I'm thrilled to talk about Sheryl's story. Let's begin. As I've mentioned, today we'll talk about the story of Sheryl's completed life. And just to frame the conversation, since Sheryl was the debut narrative that we featured in the Voices of the Completed Life podcast, just a reminder that Sheryl's voice is one voice of the completed life. And this is the beginning of an ongoing discussion or examination of the completed life. In this series of responses to our podcast episodes, this event today being the first of many to come in a series, this is not the only completed life we'll talk about, merely the first. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and let's begin our conversation. So let's start by talking about the completed life as an overarching conceptual theme. Who gets to say what is a completed life? Is this something that can only be answered by an individual? And how does someone wrestle with it? How do they get to the point of deciding their life is completed? Paul, let's start with you. Paul, I'm sorry. Please unmute.
In thinking about the completed life for my own life, it's not imminent. My life isn't nearly complete in my own view now. But I just can't really say the term to myself, the completed life. I say a complete enough life. And I do that because it's going to be a very subjective decision for me. And complete enough will mean that I've done enough things that define what I want my life to be and what I continue to be engaged by, balanced with the difficulties that are coming or already are right with me. And when that balance gets to a certain point, my life is complete enough. I'm not even sure that Sheryl's life is absolutely complete. It's completed because she completed it. And that's another aspect of the completed life. When people make their own decision, their free choice to end a life, to hasten death. What is it that is subjective? There's several crucial subjective elements here that can only be defined by the person whose life it is. One, obviously, the suffering and the burdens that are too great to go on with. Burdens can be just disappointments too. But another subjective element is the conception of their life. What is it about their life that seems to have an end point now? And a logical, appropriate, coherent endpoint. People have vastly different narratives and conceptions of their own lives to themselves and seen by people around them too. And it is just very different for one person than it is for another. And we can all sort of try to make some objective notion of, well, her life is more complete even for others than not just subjectively for herself. When we think about the coherence of a life, a novelist might write about certain characters and try to pull together all those the big story of a person's life, and we can maybe talk about the objective coherence of a person's life, and now the coherent ending is coming. But I don't want to really get close to that. A novelist may do it, but I don't think in real life, certainly not in caregiving situations, whether it be just family caregiving, friend caregiving, or professional caregiving, that we should get even close to that. Um, Sheryl, it seems to me to be a remarkable example of the completed life, um, completed on her terms and in terms of her own conception of when her life best end. And a life is not just life at moments. Her life is the life overall. She talks about her gardening, her volunteer activities, other things that have meant so much to her for so long. And it's because of those that she can say, now my life is complete enough. And I don't want to wait for that one more fall, which would make it a very unfortunate completion and drawn out.
Thank you, Paul. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I think obviously from a rational point of view, the idea of someone making this decision for themselves seems perfectly reasonable. I think the broader context is this idea or the willingness to not be so attached to life. I think that one of the problems, and certainly this is true in most of medicine, is that we have always favored life as a preeminent good to the exclusion of anything else. The need to hold on to that. And for someone to make a decision like Sheryl did, it's clearly that she holds on to life much lighter, that it isn't this desperate thing that she needs more and more of. She sees that just as another commodity that when it no longer serves her, she's able to let go of it. So you have these two poles of the primacy of life and the inevitability of death. But I would actually back that up a second and maybe about the question of suffering, because I think that's what really is central to Sheryl's story, um, is that she is so afraid of here's this elderly woman living on her own. They're friends, but there's no family nearby. There's nobody to really take care of her should anything happen. And she, as she says repetitively, she's one fall away from fill in the blank, nursing home, assisted living, disability. And that uh, consideration of suffering was unthinkable for her. And she was not going to abide by that. But to get to that point, um, she has to not be holding on to life that tightly. She has to just see it as another thing that she can say, you know what, this was good, but I'm ready to put it down. Um, I think for me, what was remarkable about Cheryl's story, um, and I think this is a woman who gave this a lot of thought, and of course, there's a context of her having um, given a podcast, given an interview. She is so clear and dispassionate and enthusiastic about the choice that she made. I've got to believe that there was an earlier moment where it was like, oh my God, this is, I'm looking over the edge of a cliff and it's like, ugh, that's a big step. I don't want to take that one. That she had to have had some sort of process in terms of fear, in terms of dread, um, that said to her, I'm not going to go there. So yeah, and I think most people that we would talk to would not be quite as philosophical as Sheryl. They would be much more centered around their fear and suffering, or the fear of suffering, as the determinant that pushes life away. Sheryl seemed to have approached it from a little bit more of a philosophical perspective.
Thank you, Mark. And Lou, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me bring up something that Mark, as a physician, can also relate to, I'm sure, which is that when I was a medical student, the expression "a completed life" was never mentioned. When I was a psychiatric resident, likewise, never mentioned. And quite frankly, in all of the subsequent academic courses that I've been in and presentations that I've listened to, this was not something that was spoken about. Had a conversation, telephone call yesterday with a Dutch philosopher. She identifies herself as an empirical ethicist, has been doing research on a completed life in Holland. And they have their own definition of it, which I think differs from what the foundation has chosen. I want to speak to it because she talked about a movement that has been going on for a number of years in the Netherlands. And it consists of a belief that elderly people who do not have major psychiatric disorders, who do not have major physical disorders, they may have some chronic things akin to what we heard about with Sheryl, who was repeatedly falling and probably had some significant frailty. But the movement was one that, at least in the Netherlands, that folk who did not fall into either of those categories, they weren't terminally ill, dying of cancer, they were not prone to major psychiatric problems throughout their lives, that those folk who sort of fit in what we would probably call the non-pathological and normal route were entitled to make some decisions about bringing their ends to a life. And it reminded me of, again, when I was a medical student, my mother taking a quick look at my psychiatric textbook that we were working on and at one of my internal medicine textbooks and saying, where's the normal in this? And pointing out quite properly, and it hasn't really, that imbalance hasn't been redressed since, medicine is about pathology. And so Mark and I come in as physicians into this, and we're dealing with phenomena when we meet somebody like Sheryl that we're not prepared for. And I know from myself, and I'll just give a little background how I got interested in this end of life stuff. I did an evaluation of a woman who had made a suicide attempt, serious suicide attempt, as close to dying as you possibly can. And the first thing that jumped out of the page when I reviewed her medical record was that she was a dialysis patient. She'd had kidney failure and for the last 10 plus years had been maintained with dialysis. And the second thing that jumped out when I went to see her was none of the things I'd been taught about depression or about the people who make clinical suicides were applicable to her. She did not meet the criteria. She did not strike me as that. She was not someone who had made previous suicide attempts. And she told me in a very rational way why she had, in this occasion, chosen to do an overdose. I asked her what to me was the immediate logical question that I had, which was, well, why didn't you just stop dialysis? If you wanted it over, why didn't you just stop dialysis? And she said that she had tried to bring up the subject with her husband, and he burst into tears. And she didn't even try to bring up the subject with her nephrologist, with her physician, because in her words, he would have considered it a professional failure. So she woke me up to the fact that there are people who certainly don't meet the same picture as one sees with folk who make suicide attempts as a product of psychiatric disorder. And this is really what got me interested in it. And as I got to say, as I listened to Sheryl, and we can talk further amongst us as panelists, she struck me as in that same vein as well. Nothing jumped out for me that this woman had the thing that people worry about, a major depression, major depressive disorder. So let me leave it at that. And again, this is something we can go back to or pursue.
Thank you, Lew. So I want to touch upon a point that you mentioned, Lew, as well as you, Mark, about the point at which perhaps the life no longer serves a person, and at what point one might wish to say that their life no longer serves them, whether it's decided based upon body frailty or some other determination. Perhaps reframed in the terms of the life serving the person living it, how can you really defend perhaps that the fact that the person must continue living their life or is wrong to make the determination that they no longer wish to continue living their life if their life no longer serves them? What are your thoughts? And feel free to jump in.
Well, again, I think it got, you know, I like the story that you told, Lew, and what this woman was saying, you know, that we don't talk about this with patients. Again, I'm going to talk about this within the clinical setting, you know, that we don't talk about it with patients because it has that quality of failure, right? Death is failure for the medical community. And so the idea of saying to somebody, again, let's say we were going to present this as an idea, like, hey, what do you think about dying? You know, you've been complaining a lot about your life. Like, do you really want to keep on going on like this? In fact, I brought this up with a patient of mine, and he thought I was being facetious. You know, he thought I was poking at him. A guy who's in terrible suffering, and there was no sense that that suffering was going to end anytime soon. So you have to start by shifting the ground of saying that the maintenance of life at all costs is not intrinsically a good. And we'll start from that perspective. Once you've accepted that life doesn't have to be held on to. And again, you know, Lew and I are of a generation where you just did everything. You know, I remember doing my medical residency before I did psychiatry. There was no such thing as do not resuscitate. And every code I ever ran to resulted in somebody dying, you know, a violent death. And there was no option, you know. Now we have a different view of that. So if you start from the perspective of life as something that could be no longer valuable or no longer necessary, then you're right. There's that personal agency about that. I think that although it's a personal decision, it has to have a certain kind of commonality that we can all understand, you know, within a community. Otherwise, it will feel to others as random and maybe even gratuitous that somebody would have ended their life. So people will understand, like, again, going back to Sheryl, Sheryl had a whole series of criteria. I want to be able to my garden, I want to be able to, I want to serve my community. These were her three criteria for when her life was going to end, and made perfect sense. And I think anybody listening to Sheryl would understand the logic behind that. If somebody said, gee, I think I want to end my life because it's Tuesday, you know, I don't like Tuesdays, that probably wouldn't fly. So that would be my only caveat with self-determination.
How about Mondays, Mark? I'm just joking, and I don't know if you heard it at all. You seem to have frozen a bit.
I don't know. Again, well, actually, though, I'll tell you the story. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there is an immortal character, and he was okay for being immortal, except for Sunday afternoons. He just couldn't tolerate Sunday afternoons. It was just, it would drag on. And it was like, so his only antidote to that, he didn't decide to kill himself. His antidote that he was going to go through the universe and insult every being in the universe. That was his new mission, to get through Sunday afternoons, was to insult everybody in the universe.
I like the phrase that it be understandable that a person sees her life as completed or complete enough. We can, I think, readily, I at least, have no trouble whatsoever seeing Cheryl's decision as understandable from her point of view. But in seeing it as understandable, I don't want to say it's objectively better way for her to complete her life or for anybody to complete their life. There may be equally good and admirable, but extremely different ways to end a life in circumstances very similar to hers. People who would adapt to not being able to do their actual physical volunteer work. People who would adapt to not being able to do their normal gardening and maybe just look at pictures of it again or have conversations with neighbors who are still actively gardening and run into this or that trouble, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we can all not only think of adaptations, but realize that many times when we see people adapt, we admire that adaptation. We don't say, oh, why did she push herself into adapting? We don't say that. We admire the person who adapts. So there are different admirable completings of lives. And again, I want to just really hold at great arm's length any objectification of any of these as, better than another. Even though I think in our society, we may actually want to say some are more admirable than others. But that's another complex subject.
Well, let me pick up, if you don't mind, Paul, where Sarah tossed this grenade in our midst about surviving. Because I know what her question made me think of was Tarzan. And a series that I followed avidly as a youth, in which Edgar Rice Burroughs spoke really for his time, when he had his character say, "I will continue to fight on while I have a breath of life in me." We just saw on the news yesterday about the Shackleton expedition to Antarctica, and how they've now found the boat tucked half a mile down in the ocean. But the story was so appealing to everyone at the time, and again, it predates me. But it speaks to the previous generation, because Shackleton, locked in the ice with his men, didn't say, "Okay, guys, let's all kill each other. Let's all take our lives." What he did was he split off in little boats and rowed, for hundreds of miles to safety, and came back with others and essentially rescued his entire expedition, which was, and the guys who were left behind didn't say, "Okay, we've had enough. Let's find ways to end our lives." So that the generations that have come before us, survival was more than admirable. It was really an attribute that everyone sort of felt made for a great story, made for heroism. What I think that Sheryl presents is a very modern, different version of things. Paul, when you're saying we shouldn't just sort of say what she did should be our model, I mean, that's correct. I think there are absolutely different ways of looking at things. And yet at the same time, I think many of us who listened to what she had to say thought, what a heroic lady. What incredible bravery in terms of what she's saying and how she is fighting against what seems to be an instinctive human quality, which is to survive, or what the more religious amongst us would speak of the sanctity of life.
Well, again, I think that, if it's appropriate to see about this over time, right, that, you know, our lifespan now is much longer. Let's go back 100 years, 200 years, and the lifespan was much shorter. To have a choice about living long,
Yeah.
frail, wasn't that often a choice. Events would catch up with you a whole lot quicker than they do now. So I think that we're in a different kind of situation, just in the same way. I mean, the irony of in a world where starvation and malnutrition exists, we in the United States talk about dieting all the time. It's on the cover of every other magazine. So I think the same thing is true about what happens when you have this might not be the right language, I apologize, an overabundance of life, and therefore have you wandered into a territory where you're now struggling, right? Dementia would not have been an issue maybe back in the 18th century because you didn't live long enough to get demented, right? Who ever got demented? You went out in a blaze of glory, or because of typhus or typhoid or malaria, something like that. Now we talk about dementia all the time as one of those really horrible things. And again, that's in Sheryl's story again about one of her being primed by these stories of bad deaths, and one of them, or more than one, having to do with that. Um, I think where Shackleton and his people are different is they had glorious purpose, and never lost that glorious purpose, even though it took a long time. The fact that they were there stuck on the ice for several years, they were still imbued by that purpose. If they hadn't had that, it would have been a different situation. So in their case, I'm going to work on the assumption that hopelessness never arose for those guys. Had there been a true sense of hopelessness, is that we're doomed and we're never getting out of here, that might have had a different story for them. So I think those is kind of the distinctions I think from then versus now.
So Mark, to your point about the frailty of life and contrasting survival with kind of a prolonged, good enough life, but life that is stretching for a very long time and perhaps has the normal challenges of everyday living accompanied with aging, of perhaps the predisposition to falling frequently, or things like that. And to Sheryl's point about being one fall away, it reminds me of a quote you reminded me of yesterday, Mark, from Bilbo Baggins and the Fellowship of the Ring, of I feel like I've been stretched way too thin, like very little butter over too much bread. Paraphrasing, of course, but to Mark Peterson's point in the chat, he's wondering, is it life that fails us, or is it our body that fails us so that life becomes unbearable? And from the perspective of Sheryl, what do you think?
don't think life failed her. I don't even think that she would say life
Look, I think most common response
failed
for most.
her.
Mark, there's a little bit of a delay with your connection. I apologize. Paul, go ahead and then we'll get back to you, Mark.
I think life failed Sheryl.
Sure.
Sheryl saw life, her life, in her context, with her conception of her own life and what she most wanted to live for, and the hope she had for the people after she was no longer here. She puts the conservation of resources pretty high on her value system. So she doesn't give up hope. She has a lot of hope. It's in fact her hope for things after her life ends that motivates her to end it now, in part. It's not the only reason she ends it. End of that thought.
Mark, back to you. Or,
Yeah.
yep, please, Mark, go
Yeah,
ahead. And then over to
gonna
Lew.
say that, yeah, I think that the, the most common thought for people is about the body failing, right? And the suffering related to the failure of the body and the presumption of failure and suffering that's going to come along. This is where it gets very tricky for us in psychiatry, is what happens when you become tired of life, but your body's okay or okay enough. And this is where it gets really like, is this depression? Is this the suicidality that we need to hospitalize people for? Or is it really an awareness of, I can't tolerate those Sunday afternoons. I'm done with that. I've checked off all the boxes. I've done everything I've wanted to do. And it just feels like rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. We would generally talk about that as depression and despondency, but I can really accept the fact that somebody may really have an appreciation of saying, I've got nothing, life has lost all zest for me, not because I'm depressed per se, is because, it would just be just repeating, it'd be just doing it over and over again. So there might be a point where it isn't about the body. It is really about the appreciation of life itself.
And I'd say life experience. I mean, one of the things that I liked a great deal, Sarah, about your decision to break Sheryl's story into two parts, with the first part being the litany of deaths that she experienced, is because that was a staggering account. I mean, I just jotted it down. She spoke about her mother's death, her father's death, her mother-in-law's death, her father-in-law's death, her brother, her daughter, her second husband. Um, there comes a point, I guess, when you are in your 80s, and I'm not quite there. I have another week to go, and I'm going to hit 72. So I'm not that far away from it, but there comes a point, I think, particularly nowadays when you're in your 80s, where whether you're unlucky or lucky, you've accumulated a lot of baggage in the form of people who you loved dying in different ways.
Lew, are you talking about the fact that she lost people or the quality of those losses?
Really both, because I think with each death that we have, that she had, she lost a part of her personal history, part of her life, all the interactions that she'd had with her mother, um, only were left for her to remember by and large. Same with a father-in-law or the daughter. So I think each of those is a punch. And then there was the quality of how they died, where she had some real bones to pick over either how medicine treated them or how fate had treated them. So I think both of those really, Mark, are what I'm speaking to. I mean, personally, I dread the most the death of my wife because we've had 40 plus years together. And when she's gone, not only will I not have somebody who I can elbow and say, "Who is that person?" But I will have lost, all sorts of memories, all sorts of interactions. I will have lost, a person who is most important to me.
And yet,
And we certainly hear stories. I'm sorry, Paul. We certainly hear stories of people who say that without my beloved, life was no longer worth living.
Yeah.
we also hear stories about people who do adapt. The ability of people to adapt, whether it to long grief, to physical impairment, all sorts of other devastating circumstances. Not everybody does adapt. Maybe not everybody is remotely even close to being able to adapt. But many people are just remarkable in the adaptation that they show to hard circumstances. And if I have any worry at all about the right of self-determination at the end of life and when to define the appropriate end of one's own life, I strongly stand by that right of self-determination. If I have any anxiety about that at all, it's that we're going to discount the capacity for adaptation. And perhaps another worry is that we get too perfectionist about our own lives. Instead of saying, here's life, what can I make of it? And it's a sacred resource. Maybe I don't use the word sacred. It's just an amazing resource, life is. Even if we're looking at life as a resource for us, which is a very instrumental way of looking at it, still, it is an amazing resource. And I don't want to get too perfectionist about what life has to be for me to be able to appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And I do worry at a time when I see a lot of people in our society being ultra perfectionist about things. They're perfectionist about their kids. If my kid doesn't get into an Ivy League school or whatever the pressure be, doesn't make NCAA one basketball recruit, I think the perfectionism about them, it's not just about others that is destructive. It's perfectionism sometimes about themselves. Even though, I mean, Shackleton was a perfectionist about an adventurer who could brave all sorts of unbelievably impossible circumstances and survive. I suppose you can look at him as a kind of perfectionism. And perfectionism in the right context can be absolutely admirable. And in other contexts, it can be the sign that we're spoiled. And I want to hold that tension. I want that tension to be alive and well.
The irony is that Shackleton never succeeded in any of his adventures. Every single one of them failed. He's a great adventurer, all failed. He never lost a man. I'm sorry, I take that back. I think one of them died of appendicitis. But in terms of exposure, he brought all his men back. He was well loved, but all his expeditions failed. I think I love what you're saying, Paul. I think the very fact that we're doing this webcast, the very fact that something like the Completed Life Initiative exists, is about the changing of the dialogue, where at one point it would have been unthinkable, as you were saying, Lew, trains way. Language didn't exist in any way, shape, or form. I think that if this becomes a thoughtful idea that people can embrace, then there is that engaged conversation that to your point, Paul says, like, what are you whining about? You know, what? It was, again, it was Tuesday? Really? You're going to do this because it was Tuesday? Like, come on. The latte was cold? Like, you know, suck it up, Buttercup. Life is worth more than that. Obviously, I'm being facetious, but yeah, then there's a possibility of debate, but it accepts that Cheryl's action is a legitimate outcome.
Yeah. And to further go with what Paul said about human beings' incredible adaptability, it takes different forms, and we need to appreciate that. So to just stay with what I appear to be focused on now, which is the death of a spouse, you know, it is said that, and I've got to witness this just in the past few weeks, that when that happens, women mourn and men replace. And damned if my best friend, whose wife died earlier this year, didn't immediately get snatched up and taken off to Arizona for a month by some woman who he had known, in fact, with his wife for a number of years. So I would just speak to the different ways that we adapt and that we cope. And again, I do think that to go back to what you said, Mark, about Cheryl's criteria for why she wanted to die, those were her. That's what she put together, and they make sense to me, but they wouldn't necessarily be applicable to you or to Paul or Sarah or to me when it came down to making that ultimate decision.
And to your points about adaptability, which are absolutely well taken, I remember asking Sheryl, you know, with such a brave and prescient presentation of her completed life, you know, it seems like you've done everything you've wanted to do. And she was very quick to say, oh, no, I haven't. I still have a bucket list. And yet, you know, her arm was in a sling. She had recently fractured her arm. She couldn't garden. It was her dominant hand. And she didn't want to be a burden anymore. She felt like she was taking up essential resources and likened it to, you know, the consciousness and crisis about climate change. And so from that perspective of, you know, maybe someone doesn't want to adapt to their change in circumstances. And, you know, Cheryl's circumstance of not having a terminal illness contrasted her very poignantly with someone like, for example, Brittany Maynard, who had the tragic circumstance of not having a choice.
You know, can I just throw some, can we play devil's advocate for a minute? And, you know, because we're being like, oh, Sheryl is courageous, Sheryl is heroic. What if we flip that and say, can we make an argument that she was really wrong? You know, because I'm sure there are going to be people who are appalled by this articulate, thoughtful woman. Is there an argument to say that she was being self-indulgent, that she should have adapted, that she should have reached out to family? Obviously, there was no family around, but obviously, you know, again, from listening to the podcast, there's at least one niece somewhere. There are grandchildren. Maybe there's a son-in-law. Where are all these people? What are they? What, they're so unloving, they're so uncaring. Can we make an argument that she should have done something different? Because I imagine other people will say, will be appalled by this articulate, thoughtful woman with no serious terminal illness decides to end her life.
I don't want to make the argument that she shouldn't have ended her life, because even if she's not suffering at the moment, she's she's even rationally, not just in terms of her own values, but she's rationally afraid of the next fall. because the next fall will perhaps be much worse.
Mhm.
People don't know what's coming around the corner. And yes, they don't know the good things that might be coming around the corner, but they also don't know the bad things. And she tries to size up what those are. And then in the context of the values of her life, and I think we have to sort of picture her saying, what does my life stand for? I know life is more valuable than just what it stands for, but my life is in part what it stands for. I've made my life that. And I want my life, which is in part my life as it lives on in others after I die, because that's still part of my life. We have a social life. We're going to have a social life after we die. It's just going to be sort of it'll be one way, but that still can be a lively life. She wants that to be representative of the life she most wanted to be. And it will be if she ends it now, I think, in a stronger way than if she had adapted. So yes, the remarkable ability to adapt should never be overlooked, but we should never say they ought to adapt. So I'm really, even though I'm fearful of the perfectionism in the society, I'm also, I think, I would be very strongly opposed to saying that what she did was the wrong thing.
Well, what I'm surprised by in her narrative is that neither, at least from her description, neither her primary care doctor nor the bioethicist or the review board physician nor her therapist ever seemed to argue with her. At least she doesn't describe that. Anybody said, like, wait a second, you can get an aid. We can help your house become more friendly so you don't fall. We'll get you a walker. We'll get you in PT so your legs are like, where's your son? Like, where can we help you do all that? And I'm and again, I'm playing devil's advocate because I do appreciate and agree with what Sheryl did. But those other things being unanswered leave open questions for, again, I'm saying this guardedly, a rush to judgment on her part.
I've told my wife, and I've told one of my best friends this also, that yes, I want the right to die when I decide it's at the right time. But I also want an interrogator. And I have a promise from two people to be my interrogator. If I can understand them at the time, hopefully I will. So yeah, I mean, I want to be challenged. And I don't know how in practice you, Mark, and Lew have developed the art of interrogation, friendly interrogation that can strike some people as being an opponent, but it's that in philosophy we talk all the time about the constructive opponent, the constructive critic, who maybe seem full on devastating critic, but darn it all, that's constructive.
Yeah, I'm not so sure for myself, Paul, that there can be a constructive interrogator when it comes to these end-of-life decisions that folk make. I mean, my hat is off to you for having lined up a couple, but to just go to what Mark spoke to, which is what about the family members who she's leaving behind? Call it the family card, if you will. It's almost an unanswerable tactic that those who love you will throw out, which is basically, how could you leave when I'm going to be graduating, or your grandchild or great-grandchild is about to be born, or any number of, we want you to come live with us. and be, more of a part of our family. No, we don't really, but we're going to say that anything other than what you're saying to us, in which the meta message is, you're not important enough to me, that I should continue to live, that I should continue to bear whatever suffering I'm undergoing. The family card is incredibly potent, and it's sort of it's one that has a lot of juice to it. There's kind of no end to the scenarios. And as a consultation psychiatrist who is involved with a lot of end-of-life decisions in the hospital, palliative medicine folk know about and dread the family member, usually who comes the furthest distance. So if it's an East Coast patient, it's the family member who comes from Seattle, Washington, who says, no, you can't do that. You can't stop the dialysis. You can't, give up at this particular point. We dread that because there's almost no answer to it. And it usually comes when everybody else has finally gotten to accept that on the person's terms, the patient's terms, they are suffering. And it is understandable on their terms as to why they want to bring the suffering to an end. And it isn't because anybody doesn't love them any more or less.
So Steve in the chat mentions that the quote unquote devil's advocate position is so important, but the final decision must rest with the person facing the completion of his, her, or their life. And I couldn't agree with you more, Steve. And Toby also chimed in saying that Sheryl may not have thought that she was of good value. In a world where resources are short, she felt she was not the best consumer of those resources. And I know in episode 2, Sheryl mentions fondly, I might add, about the story of Inuit women as she perceived it. And jumping a little bit ahead to that perspective on the point at which someone's body may be deemed to no longer serve them within the context of serving a community and being of service, or being capable of being of service, as any one person defines it for themselves. What did you think about Cheryl's mention of the Inuit women?
I was thinking about that aspect of her as maybe an after the fact rationalization. Not that it's not a bad thought, but we don't live in a society that values that kind of self-sacrifice. That's not us. I'm more willing to believe that the thing that drove Sheryl is the emotionality, the passion about what she felt. And then once she made that decision, it was like, well, how can I validate my position by those other things? It's like after you buy the car, then you look at the reviews that say, oh, it was the right car to buy. It's the same thing here. I think it's like, well, once I've decided I'm going to end my life, what are other good reasons to end my life? Well, I don't want to take up valuable resources that I don't need and maybe some young person needs. And it's a beautiful idea. I mean, I really love it. Did it drive her? We're not, I mean, even if that Inuit story is true, and why is it just Inuit women, right? Inuit men get to hang around and be useless, but the Inuit women walk off and they die of hypothermia. Really? Doesn't make much sense to me. So I'm not sure about that.
Well, I think it is an apocryphal story, quite frankly, and a rare occurrence, if at all. And it does cut across gender line, as told. I would suggest, if people haven't gone online and seen a website that's called Dead at Noon, it's worth taking a look. Dead at Noon is a letter that was posted after the death of an older woman, somebody who sounds quite comparable to Sheryl, and who had Alzheimer's disease, and who had reached the point where she too felt that the value she was giving was not worthy of the resources that were being consumed. A Canadian woman, she just wrote this incredibly eloquent letter making that case. And I think it was just, it just reads as very real. So I don't think Sheryl was just sort of spinning rationalizations for why she was approaching what made sense to her to be the terminus of her life. There are plenty of others, Mark, in our society who still feel that sort of way. And I would raise another question for us to kick around, which has to do with the word burden. Because opponents to aid in dying are quite upset with the fact that so many of the people, when queried, who make use of this means to end their lives, in effect are saying that they're doing it because they feel like they have become a burden, be it to society or to their loved ones. And this, Paul, I would ask you about, is cast as being a unacceptable reason for why somebody should end their life. And so I'll just sort of toss it up to you. What do you guys think about that? Is burden the sort of thing that we should toss out as a legitimate reason, or is it in fact something that should be accorded some weight?
I suppose we could speak of the burden card as well as the family card being played here, and it can be played in both directions. Oh, people who you think you're being a burden to by living longer, Paul, if you are a burden to them, their attitude should not be that you are a burden to them. They should see you as a wonderful presence in their life, even when it's disrupting their life a lot, because you are who you are. You're their father or whoever. People are not obligated to say either, well, you're not really a burden to me, Dad, living longer, and they're not obligated to accept that burden when it's an unreasonable burden. And I want to ask myself, when am I being an unreasonable burden to them? And I don't want them to be a burden to them for years and years in severe dementia. I have seen people whom I think have relatively value of their own lives to themselves because they can't anticipate tomorrow. And when they get to tomorrow, they can't remember yesterday. And they are, in fact, for years and years and years, occupying the lives of their closest loved ones in ways that are, if we're frank about it, just not good for their loved ones. And it's not even good for their loved ones' love of them. And that's when I think, I'm going to draw the line. Yes, other people should not see me as a burden just because I'm staying alive. But darn it all, sometimes I am a burden to people in a very reasonable, almost objective way. And I need to take some responsibility for that. And that aspect, even though I think in Sheryl's example, it's much more extreme in a way, though it's not a pejorative word, than the situation I've described. I think she has a right to say, well, other people shouldn't see me as a burden if I live longer, but I don't want to be that kind of burden insofar as I define it as a burden. It's not the only admirable stance for a person in her circumstance to take, but I certainly don't want to cast it as not as good as other stances she could have taken.
Hmm.
And
No,
I would
I
hope
think that's,
her relatives wouldn't pin that on her either.
well, I think your point's well taken, Paul, that it would sound like the height of cruelty to say, like, Mom, you're a real pain in the ass. Like, why don't you just off yourself?
Sure.
Yeah, that would be awful in that regard. But I think it's really true. And how often do you hear from people when someone has been caring for an elderly parent who's been demented for many years and has that feeling of release and relief
Mm.
when that person finally died? And I think it is a legitimate um, motivation to not want to be a burden, to not want to be that person who's going to suck up resources and time and emotional distress, to be a shell of of who you once were. In that kind of situation, I know that that's been one of the big arguments or fears of the people who oppose even medical assistance in dying is the financial aspect and the burden aspect. Well, maybe more the financial aspect is where that thing comes up. But I think it is a legitimate concern. And how can it not be? Just in the same way in Cheryl's description of her daughter, and they keep on asking you, are you depressed? Are you depressed? And it's like, I'm dying of pancreatic cancer. I have 2 kids I'm leaving behind. Like, what? I'm supposed to be happy? And the same thing here. And actually, Lew, I think this was in a podcast I heard of you talking about your book about, was it about Admiral Nimitz? Did you tell that story? Right? Where he was very, very concerned about the money he had accumulated and saved over life, and he did not want to be squandered in a nursing home. This was his legacy to his family. And he said, that's not the way to be. Both on like, wow, all of Mom's money went to the nursing home, or like, I don't want to do that. So that's got to be an issue also. Again, I think apropos of the same issue of burden.
By the way, it was Admiral Nimitz's son who this story was that I wrote about in A Compassionate Ending was the book that came on. And yeah, he and his wife both felt very strongly that they did not want to give their money to a nursing facility. They preferred that their family receive it. And in fact, they chose to wait until January 2nd to end their lives, because they did take their lives together, so that they could write out a tax-free check to all of those children that they had. Right. So yeah, people have different notions of what's important to them, and yeah, that way into it.
And Cheryl was very perceptive in terms of saying, I've canceled all of my credit cards. I have all of my ducks lined up, as it were. And perhaps, and I'm curious what you all think about shifting the framing from away from perhaps this person becomes a burden to other people, whether it's family, community, taxing upon resources, or the medical system, and perhaps reframed as a burden to oneself, as upholding the core notion of what is a completed life, and whether Cheryl's life was a burden, becoming a burden for her, not necessarily for others.
That's hard to read with Cheryl. Again, we just have, about an hour plus of dialogue with her, or mostly just her. So it's a hard thing to know she certainly spoke about her anticipation of what to feel for her. I don't know, that she didn't sound burdened by herself. She sounded like, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be, in pain or suffering over all that kind of stuff. So, there isn't that quality of self-despondency. Again, I'm not sure, because again, this touches on that curious issue about what is depression and what is, the end of the rational end of life. She certainly didn't sound that way. She said, "Look, I don't want to be in a nursing home. I don't want to get a bed sore like my husband did. I don't want to be on a ventilator like my those kind of things." So, um, I don't get that sense to yourself. I mean, I certainly have patients right now who are very ill, um, bedridden, uh, um, quality of life. They're suffering right now. They are annoyed with themselves. They are a burden to themselves. They every day is just, you know is a problem. It's every day, it's like, oh, I'm still in this hell, and so I'm ready to escape it.
Mhm. Thank you, Mark. The connection was a little choppy, but I think we were able to hear you and make out what you said. Thank you. Lou or Paul, what are your thoughts?
I'll pass it to Paul on this one.
Well, Mark said, I think what I wanted to say. I have less to say. Yes.
So to the point of, Cheryl's rationality, I think we're all in agreement that she, in addition to her bravery, she was an extremely rational person, and communicated herself very clearly and in a straightforward manner. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. When in episode 2, where Sheryl makes the important distinction for herself about rational suicide versus emotional suicide. How do you approach that kind of conversation? What was your impression when you first heard Sheryl make this distinction? And in light of Cheryl's overarching narrative, how do you um, put her distinction in the context of her overall sense of her completed life?
Yeah. Well, let me jump on a piece of what you're saying. I mean, I have the term that I've used is a clinical suicide versus a rational suicide. And there are probably a number of different other kinds of suicides that are out there, including an altruistic suicide. The classic soldier who jumps on the grenade to save her colleagues. Um, Again, Mark will back me up on this, I think, that psychiatrists we be, but we're not taught to distinguish between these things in our formative years. And even now, the field, the specialty struggles to make the distinction. I think there is increasing awareness in the field that we have to make the distinction, that the people who are coming forward, like Sheryl, or the people who live in states where they qualify and meet the criteria, the eligibility criteria for aid in dying, are often just, cut from a different cloth than the folk who I would see on my consultations in the hospital who had recurrent depressions, had many previous times in which they had taken their lives. or tried to take their lives, who came from families where both psychiatric illness and the behavioral phenomena of suicide was rife and very available to be seen. I think a distinction needs to be made, and we are lacking in accepted vocabulary to make that distinction. I'm actually part of a group that has been meeting on a regular basis, a number of psychiatrists that Compassion and Choices have pulled together to try to argue that use of the word suicide is just so pejorative that it should be inapplicable to situations like that of Sheryl, or very specifically that of the people who become candidates for aid in dying. I'm part of that group. I feel that way, and yet I also, have to say it's inescapable that in Cheryl's case, she researched and came up with a way to end her life. And by most broad definitions of suicide, including her own, the word is applicable. So some scattered thoughts.
I've always been opposed to the position that Compassion and Choices, for example, has taken, that you dare not call it physician-assisted suicide because people will not vote to support it in referenda if it's labeled that, whereas they will support it if you call it aid in dying or medical aid in dying. I mean, it is literally, if you look at the definition of suicide, it's directly and intentionally causing your own death, not just risking it. Maybe, in fact, the soldier who throws himself on the grenade, well, the risk is so high that I suppose you could say that she or he is knowingly doing what will directly kill them. But voluntarily stopping eating and drinking is directly and irreversibly causing one's death. Without food and water, if you continue to follow through on when you start voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, you're going to die. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's no miracle that's going to happen. Oh, she lived, even though she never ate and drank for 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever. It's not going to happen. So it is suicide in the literal sense in a dictionary. Now, are we going to say, well, it's not because we don't like what happens when we call it that? I regard that as, frankly, just not being straightforward about the language. And if you want to define suicide normatively, well, suicide is killing yourself when, directly killing yourself, when it's bad to kill yourself. That's the normative definition of suicide. I think there's a perfectly legitimate descriptive definition of suicide. It's different than the normative definition, and you might want to use the normative definition in legalization of medical aid in dying. There's always a provision in the statute or whatever the legal form is that says assisting in medical aid in dying is not assisting in a suicide, which seems to be a way of saying it's not suicide. Well, for good reason, we don't want to make assisting in medical aid in dying a physician who does that, a clinician who does that, vulnerable to being prosecuted for assisting in suicide. Darn good reason for putting that clause in the law. But it's not, sometimes legally we have to change the meaning of terms or stipulate that it has this meaning, not another meaning. But suicide just does mean intentionally and directly causing your own death. But philosophers haven't had a problem with this like psychiatrists, because there's always been a tradition of, is suicide in circumstances rational? And there have been strong advocates for rational suicide in appropriate circumstances for millennia
Yeah.
in philosophy.
Well, again, I'm sorry, Luke, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly say the same comes with killing, with homicide, where we all sort of acknowledge that the guy who's breaking into your house brandishing a gun, if you happen to have a gun and shoot him and kill him, that's kind of an acceptable, good killing that takes place, should not be called homicide, perhaps, or the soldier now in Ukraine who is defending their country, who is shooting Russian soldiers who are invading their country. We say that this is good, and that one should not use the term homicide for it. So, I mean, I think there's a comparability that can be said there as well.
Well, I guess for our purposes, it's the marketing issue, right? Of the emotionally laden value of suicide and everything it conjures up, that it freaks people. It'll freak people out, to use that language. Oh, you're advocating suicide. Well, isn't that something that you and me, Lou, particularly as psychiatrists,
Yeah.
it's been our bread and butter from the first day we stepped into residency. And now we're trying to redefine or segregate out what these different terms are, and the language is very, very clumsy about how to talk about this. I was going to bring up another issue, and I wonder what you think about, because it's in the same vein of this, and that is the discussion about the struggle that Sheryl had to find a method to end her life. And her search to do what she did, and how obviously she prevailed, because we know her life ended last November. What I wonder about certain patients of mine who have had unexplained, were unexpected suicides, and in each of them they were violent. And I begin to wonder, although I was treating them for depression, had they made a decision that, they were done? They had suffered too much. They weren't getting any better. There were so many problems in their lives that they just had to end it. And the problem is that the only way, because they could think of doing it, was violent. One stepped in front of a truck, one jumped off a bridge, one set himself on fire. Were these, in fact, the kind of despondent clinical suicides that you're talking about, Lou? Or were these actually rational choices, but they were compelled to do it that way because there was no easier method for them? I don't know what your thought about methodology and people's self-determination.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me part of my role in this panel discussion is to talk about medicine's failings, or the things it hasn't tackled. And oddly enough, one of the things it hasn't tackled is good ways to die. All the medications, for example, that we have were developed to either cure people or prolong life or ameliorate suffering. And no attention to speak of has gone into what might be the perfect pill to take our lives, or a combination of pills that might take our lives. What I found, what I continue to find quite sad are these violent deaths that you're talking about, Mark. And I find them tragic, not just because of the person who dies, but really because of the impact of the people who find them. And the people who live with the knowledge that your patients set themselves on fire, and just how desperately suffering they were that they had to resort to something like that, or stepped in front of a truck. And the impact on that truck driver, who for the rest of her life or his life will have to carry that, or the impact on the first responders, the police, the EMTs who came to deal with those bodies and had to take in those traumatic circumstances. So I think it's desperately awful to have to fall back on such things. Do I blame medicine for not having developed the perfect pill, the peaceful pill? No, but there's part of me that kind of wishes that there was such a thing out there. And maybe part of what we might also spend a little time talking about, since we're dealing with ways, methods, means to end your life, was what Sheryl had come upon. And I don't know if people want to speak to the nitrogen gas method that she had come up with.
Well, she certainly did her own research. I mean, she went to a great deal of trouble and effort in deciding what the best way and most assured way would be. And then she went to a great deal of effort to get it all arranged, including the duplicity with the people she was buying the nitrogen from, the equipment for it.
Mm.
I don't know what option she looked at as thoroughly as she looked at the option she chose. I don't know whether she looked at voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, for example, as a way of hastening death. It has both advantages and disadvantages relative to her nitrogen method. The advantage is you don't need to bring other people in who might be doing something illegal. You don't have to lie to people or be deceptive in what you're doing. You can be open about it because it's everybody's legal right to hasten their death by stopping eating and drinking. Now, there are caveats to be put on that. Are they rational? Could you stop them? Well, can you actually force feed a person? Are you going to go to force feeding when they have a right to refuse medical interventions that the force feeding would amount to? No, you don't. So their right there protects them and their right to hasten their death by voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. It disciplines itself because it takes a person with great determination. So only people with great determination are going to use that method. And so people who are waffling in any way simply won't carry through on it or even initiate it. It can be relatively comfortable when it's supported, properly supported. It's not if it's not properly supported, or often not. I have no idea whether she considered another method. Certainly the effort to which she had to go to use the method she did makes me, and the fear that she would be discovered along the way and would be stopped, etc. That makes me, like you, shrink, Lew, from the violent methods that people feel they have to resort to. I sort of shrank from Sheryl's having to use the nitrogen method because it was more burdensome to her than it should, as a method, than it should have been, given the clear-headedness of her decision to hasten her death. I wish it hadn't been that burdensome and that complicated.
Mark, you want to speak to this? I have a couple words I can say about the nitrogen method otherwise.
I mean, I'm aware of it as a method. Again, I think I thought what was interesting when she was telling the story was when she called some, I guess, company and said, and they said, "Oh, we don't sell that to people because, gosh, you'd be surprised how many people call up and wanting to end their life that way." And Cheryl said, "Really? Oh, I'm so shocked. I'm surprised." Um, it it just throws all of this into such a quandary about the whole discussion because it's not on an even playing field. I mean, we're having this conversation about completed life and rational death and all that kind of stuff, but this technical aspect is a huge stumbling point. And I'm not exactly sure what its resolution looks like, or even in the context of our conversation about it. So,
Well, what Paul called duplicity has kind of had a role in these end of life issues really since the days, at least, of the Hemlock Society, where at that time the preferred choice of method was to talk your doctor into giving you a lethal amount prescriptions for barbiturates by going in and complaining of your sleep problem and not hesitating to another doctor and complain of your sleep problem and acquire sufficient medication in that way. The nitrogen thing does indeed involve some duplicitous. You're certainly not buying it to brew coffee, which I looked up. I Googled and discovered I'm not a coffee drinker, so I did not know how popular nitro coffee is it? Nitro brew is right now.
Nitro Brew.
Yeah, but the way I have come to know about it is through both the suicide manuals that are out there that Sheryl alluded to, and also another organization, Right to Die organization that's out there, the Final Exit Network, which controversial, but I am one of those who admire what they do. And their preferred method that they will give people information about is to make use of nitrogen gas. And as Paul said, there are pros and cons of VSED, and there's pros and cons of nitrogen, which, and among the pros are that in the matter of a couple of breaths, you lose consciousness, and within a few minutes, you die. So it certainly has that plus side to it. Negative side being if you really want to keep what you did secret, then somebody has to remove the equipment after you've lost consciousness and died. And again, there is this preparatory duplicitness that does take place in acquiring the canister that's needed for this. And there's also the ugliness and the association that we have. You don't asphyxiate, you don't get starved for air, but you are dying from inhaling a inert gas that shuts your breathing down in your brain. And so there is all of that. But I was intrigued that she brought that up as the method that she was preparing with, that she had come to.
So Cheryl's mention of, figuring out how to prepare nitro brew was, an interesting part of the dialogue. and as you heard in episode 2, she really struggled with finding that preferred method, and she researched it for years. And like you mentioned, Lou, Derek Humphrey's book, Final Exit, was a big help to her. And yet, her mention of learning how to make nitro brew really highlights the fundamental issue of, you know, why is something like rat poison still, legal and accessible to people, and yet medications to, control the timing and circumstances of one's death are illegal substances, where people like Sheryl, who deem that their lives are completed, have to go find, you know, forms of nitrogen and create, stories and rationales for why they might need use of it in form of justification. How do we make sense of that? What is it, a cultural perspective based upon where we are currently in America, as opposed to other countries like Colombia or the Netherlands, where, physician aid in dying, or I'm sorry, physician assisted dying rather than self-administered, is legal. What do we think?
Well, I'm no legal expert about the Netherlands, but I think it would be difficult for Sheryl to have been euthanized in the Netherlands in her circumstance. She's not terminally ill at all. She doesn't have a medical condition that's imminent enough. Now, the Dutch and the Belgians have the cases they call tired of life.
Yes.
And I think those, but they guard them rather carefully, and they have to be screened. The procedures for getting euthanasia when you're doing it because you're tired of life are not easy to go through, and I'm not sure that she would have been approved for it.
I think she might have, Paul.
She might have, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's not a dunk shot.
No, I mean, my take, again, like I say, I spoke with a ethicist from the Netherlands. My take on things is that they rely a great deal on the relationship that the physician has over time with the individual. And I would guess that this is a woman who potentially could have had one where most physicians would have felt, nah, she's not depressed, nah, she's not irrational. Yeah, what she's saying makes sense, and she's being consistent about it. And the other thing about the Netherlands, which stands out in contrast to us, is that they don't rely on that people have to be actively dying. That she did not require, we do not require people to have a terminal illness where they're going to be dead within 6 months, regardless of what is done or not done for them. And what they do focus on in the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg and Canada now is suffering, and whether it is enduring and not something that can be anticipated to be fixed or changed.
But in Cheryl's case, or in the people who do preemptive VSED, for example, or preemptive suicide to avoid long years in dementia, they're not doing it to avoid suffering. They're doing it to avoid unacceptable deterioration. That's what they fear in those years of severe dementia.
Yeah, but what the Dutch would be saying,
and so the notion of unbearable, if you have to be enduring unbearable suffering, that is a necessary condition of being approved for euthanasia,
yes,
being approved for medical aid in dying, whether it's self-administered or physician-administered.
yes,
That is a very strong limitation on people's, I think, legitimate choices about when to die, because some of the reasons for dying good reasons for dying, acceptable reasons of dying, reasons that people ought to be acknowledged to have a right to act on, are not to avoid unbearable suffering. They're, for example, that my life is complete enough in the larger circumstances of what my life is. It's a rather extreme notion of self-determination, to be sure, at the end of life, but I think it's the right one. And I don't think the Dutch one of emphasis on unbearable suffering is the right one.
Mhm.
And they themselves admit that they don't really live by it. They'll call unbearable suffering something that you and I probably wouldn't call unbearable suffering in order to get it in as legal. And I
Yeah.
don't like that kind of duplicity about the terminology either that their format forces them into.
Mhm. Well, what you're saying makes me think about the man whose story I've been writing about, this latest book project, who was a young man who had Alzheimer's disease for about 4 years, was still probably in the early to at most middle stages of it. Um, was he suffering? Damn right he was suffering. Every day he was aware of what he had lost, what he could no longer do. Could he use the remote control on his television? Not anymore. Could he follow the plot? Could he read a news story and be confident that he caught it, or sit in the midst of a conversation with his family and feel like he was giving as good as he was getting the context? He wasn't. Um, he was not suffering, writhing around, in pain, in physical pain, but he was experiencing what was for him, and wouldn't have been, for maybe 95% of people out there. I mean, he was a particular guy who stuff was important, and for him, suffering. And that's how we saw it.
But he was in moderate dementia. You get past, you have enough cognitive decline, further cognitive decline, and you no longer have the cognitive level to be able to suffer except for sort of raw physical pain. And that's
I
what
don't know if I accept.
many people fear or don't want, they're passionate about not wanting to live those 5, 6, 7 years, and it really can be that long in severe dementia. They won't be likely be suffering then because they don't have enough cognitive capacity to suffer, and they're not in pain. They're not in physical pain.
Yeah.
They just have a life.
I think that
They know they will have a life that is an unacceptable way for their life to end. And the justification for them ending it when that starts is not legitimately really suffering. It's that it's not an acceptable deterioration.
Mark, go ahead.
I don't know that I would. Yeah, yeah. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with you, Paul. And again, just from seeing people in nursing homes who were deeply demented, and there was this sense of you would look at their faces, and there was a real sense of anguish. You know, in that where something was profoundly missing. It's hard to talk about because obviously they were no longer capable of communicating, but these are not happy looking people. These are not just people who just look vacuous. There is a sense of anguish on a very profound level, I think, of something being wrong, of some primitive level that life is broken in some way. So I don't know that they're not in some sort of psychic pain, that they're missing the conversations, that their brains are not functioning properly, that their bodies are not functioning properly. Um, so I don't really buy the argument that at a certain point you will be beyond care. Again, this is hypothetical, really, but that's a lot of us who have worked with those patients, and again, in the horror of a lot of nursing homes, will say this is terrible. And I remember
It,
my wife told this
we
story
can't generalize.
about being well, I don't know, being in a nursing home where one woman was very demented, and the woman sitting next to her said, "Well, she has no voice anymore. I'm the one who speaks for her." when she's struggling or when she's suffering, when she's in pain. And they had this real bond. So I'm all with Lew. I'm like,
No,
that's a tough.
all I want to argue is that there are cases of the so-called contented demented. My late wife's mother was a classic case near the end of her life of the contented demented. She would coo when you stroked her arm. There was no way in the world you could classify her as suffering in the last several years of her life until the staff would force her to go to the breakfast table and be fed when she didn't want to get out of bed and go to the breakfast table, even if it wasn't going to be enough nutrition that she then was going to be getting. But except for that being forced to eat, she was not suffering in the last couple of years of her life. But it was not it's definitely not a kind of life that her children would want for themselves. They regarded that as, for themselves, prospectively unacceptable, even though they knew that they might be one of the contented demented too, who would coo when their child stroked their arm.
Yeah.
So stepping away from conversation about dementia and Alzheimer's, because that's something we could absolutely spend 2 more hours discussing. And with the interest of time, that our time here is running short, I want to bring our attention to a comment that Steve put into the chat a while back, but I think it's relevant to conclude our discussion. He says, "My mother recently died at 100 years old. 3 months. She was 100 years, 3 months, and a few days. In her last year, I believe she really was just taking up space. She didn't do anything except sit in her chair, briefly visit with the rare visitor in my sister's home. She enjoyed her 100th birthday, but that was a highlight in her final year. I couldn't and I can't imagine living in the state that she was in. It wasn't bad, but it surely wasn't good." And I really thank you, Steve, so much for sharing about your mother's story in the chat. I think it ties beautifully to the story of Sheryl and how Sheryl herself was incredibly brave and forthcoming in presenting her narrative in the way that she presented it. Really taking a stance upon the completed life that's separate from terminal disease. And so I wanted to invite each of you, our esteemed panelists today, and thank you all so much for your incredible insights and conversation today. Starting with Paul, to wrap up, final thoughts on Sheryl's narrative, the completed life, and our conversation today.
Sheryl's story is so clear, as several of you have commented. The clarity of her thinking about this, the willingness, her willingness to be interviewed by you, Sarah, and tell her story, which, among other things, I mean, it does take, even if it's the story she badly wants to tell, it takes a courage to tell it, and especially to do the second part, the nitro brew part of the story, because what if she changed her mind? She's made it public now. She's got this out there. Was she boxing herself in? She had the courage to say, I'm sure she thought this through, that I'm going to do this because I want other people to hear my story, because I think they can see an example in it. Despite the fact that there are actually some costs to me in doing this. I admire her very much for doing that, even if there are many, many other ways of living the life that she was in that other people might have chosen.
And Mark, your thoughts?
I think Paul is right in things he says. Um, I what for me, Cheryl's description of her life and death is the beginning of this inquiry. Uh, um, as Paul said, she made this public, taking that risk of people might stopping her, and I just wonder about all the people who are doing this in secret, who are doing this without anybody's knowledge, and they're suffering in silence and by themselves, that they don't have support for their choices. They are so clear in their resolve, but have to hide it from everybody. And if this is a methodology, if this is a way for people, perhaps anonymously, to be brought into this discussion, to know that there is a place for them, there are people who support their perspective on deciding when their life is completed, or as Paul says, completed enough. I think that has a lot of value in terms of offering people a great deal of compassion and care, and something of a community while they do that. So I think Sheryl acting as a bellwether, perhaps for others, I think is really wonderful. And I want to thank Paul and Lew, Sarah, and Completed Life Initiative for this opportunity to discuss this and really make it more visible to the general population. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And Lew, last but not least.
Well, this is really one of those times you don't want to be the third person, the last person to speak up. So I'll keep it really quite brief because, I mean, this has been very evocative for me. As you could hear in my comments, it has brought up a lot of thoughts and experiences that I have had, that I am having. I mentioned the website Dead at Noon, which incidentally is one word, no spaces in there, which is the story of Gillian Bennett, who again just struck me now as how similar she was to our person who spoke up and who told us her tale, and my admiration for people who are willing to put their stories out there for all of us to consider, accept in some cases, reject other aspects of it, but who move us. And I feel really quite moved by Cheryl's words, and also, I got to admit, envious, because I don't think that when I'm 80 or in my 80s that I'm going to be in any way as able to put it out there the way that she did.
Thank you, Lew. Well said by all. And I just want to offer a round of applause to the three of you for an excellent and fascinating discussion today. I learned so much from you today, so thank you. And it was also, I must say, a tremendous honor to interview Sheryl and to have the honor to share her story with all of you and the world via our website. So much gratitude to Sheryl for her bravery. I want to invite all of you who submitted questions that we didn't have time to answer to email us at info@completedlife.org. And we'll be happy to answer your questions offline, given that we're out of time today. And please keep the conversation going. You know, this is just the starting point. This is the first response event conversation to our podcast narratives. If you know of someone who has a similar story or perhaps different story to the one that Sheryl has told, please let us know. Please refer them to us so that we may feature them in a subsequent podcast episode. We're always eager to hear your stories about the completed life and to share them if you're so willing. So please stay tuned for more podcast episodes on Voices of the Completed Life, further events and programs from us here at the Completed Life Initiative. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. For those who are watching playback, this will be a recording available shortly on our website. So stay tuned for an email about that coming soon. And please, as always, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts. Our website, again, is www.completedlife.org. Thank you all. It's been an honor today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. Take care and see you soon.
Take care. Thank you.